Good morning and welcome to Virtual Horror Con, where we are raising funds for the World Health Organization's COVID-19 Solidarity Relief Fund. With me today are my panelists for a wonderful topic of setting tone and atmosphere in horror. That can be in writing, video, tabletop games. We have a wonderful panel of experts and friends who are ready to talk about it. Please introduce yourselves, my wonderful guests.
Sure. I'll go first. Hi, I'm Mike Andryuk. I'm a host of Dark Days Radio. I've done a little bit of horror writing as well for RPGs and such, and just excited to talk about atmosphere.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Bryk, otherwise known as Jax. My pronouns are she, her. I am an award-winning freelance writer for LARPs and tabletops, as well as a designer and safety consultant, and I am super stoked to talk about tone and buy-in with the rest of this wonderful panel.
Hey, I'm Jason Carl. I'm the brand marketing manager for World of Darkness, Vampire the Masquerade writer, the host of LA by Night, Seattle by Night, and currently my desk by daytime. Thank you very much for having me. Excited to talk about tone and atmosphere in horror and support this awesome cause.
Hi, my name's Nick Francia. I'm the content designer for Rogue Robot Studios. I'm also a professional freelance visual effects artist. I love horror. I love talking about horror, and I am very excited for this panel today.
I'm Wesley Franks, or Wesley Franks. I am the founder of Carrying Comfort Studios, a new horror-focused and writing-focused stream. And I have a Shudder account, so I think I know a little bit about horror.
Just a tad.
Just a tad.
Well, welcome. Go ahead, Jack.
I'm drinking blood orange soda, so I too know a little about horror.
Quite possibly
So
darker
on
than black
brand.
coffee. Yeah.
Bitter and murky here.
Really, the only credentials you need.
I don't know if I would go that far, but
I'd also just like to point out that people are shouting our names in chat, and I feel kind of like a rock star, and that's amazing.
That's because you are.
Jax, you are a rock star. Were you not aware of this? Were you not told? Did you not get the newsletter?
I'll fight you, Jason. I'll fight you.
Wow, this is
I love you.
I don't know who to put my money on.
rolling
at
for
this
initiative
point.
this early. It's different for me, but okay.
So
All
each
right.
of you have many different walks of life and experiences on how you've set tone and atmosphere for your viewers, your readers, your people who watch the different horror things you put together. What are some of the ways that you set tone in horror?
That's not an open-ended question at all.
I mean, I'll go.
Sure.
So the line that I've worked most on so far for Chronicles of Darkness is Changeling the Lost. And our horror is kind of a weird, liminal, very much sort of line between pain and pleasure horror, because it's very much that horror that gets inflicted on you through prolonged gaslighting and abuse and constant heights of emotion. So writing for Changeling is very much sort of writing prose poetry in a lot of ways. You're working on dream logic, you're working on half-remembered stories, you're working on how does my body feel the changes that were made to me by someone else? How does my body remember what I don't? So a lot of it is this very visceral writing that is also very improbable and beautiful, but fucking horrifying at the same time. If you've read Changeling the Lost second edition, there's a lot of little fiction snippets in between the explanations of the Durance and the escape and the hedge, and all of them are just these weird one little paragraph bites of horror, which are about, oh, my keeper, like, I am obviously summarizing, so please don't take this as the epitome of the horror in the game, but my keeper kissed me on the mouth and sewed butterflies onto my skin, and every time the needle pierced my flesh, I felt the, ecstasy of serving this person, but also I felt trapped and horrified. And it's that eeriness, that juxtaposition, that constant, I want to be here, but also my body is screaming at me to leave because we are in danger. And that is the core of Changeling's horror. That is the core of Changeling's tone, is that contradiction, that juxtaposition, that horror of I want to be here, but also I don't.
Right, and it goes back to, we were talking a little bit before the panel about obviously consent and making sure that everyone's comfortable in play. And with Changeling, it's great because you control that. You kind of write your backstory as far as where you were in the hedge and how you're going to be role-playing someone that has that traumatic experience. And we actually have a panel, I think it's tomorrow, called Tabletop Horror, and I think it's like using it for therapy, which a lot of articles have been coming out about, which is great. You know, it's definitely a genre that allows you to explore so many perspectives and things.
I've actually explained horror gaming to my therapist as psychodrama. So yeah, there's a lot there. But something also about Changeling, and I do want to let the other panelists speak, but something I think is the core of Changeling is the idea that while your character did go through a durance, that's not the core part of the game. The horror is you don't remember all of it, or it all comes back in flashbacks and nightmares. So it's this idea that you went through something horrible and traumatic, and your memory is fragmented in some places and horribly clear in others, you know, like a standard traumatic memory. And now you have to live with something that your body remembers, but your mind is trying to protect you from.
Very true.
Yeah, so it's very much about the phrase I like to use is dealing and healing with Changeling.
Jax, how do you, when you're dealing with that kind of fragmentary narrative that's explored either in flashbacks or dreams or piecemeal exposition, not unlike like the film Memento comes to mind, where the protagonist discovers the past through the present. How do you set that tone? Is it individual to the character and player, or does the tone relate back to the overall theme of the chronicle, or both?
I think it's actually
or neither.
For Changeling specifically, and I'm sorry, I really do want other panelists to get a chance to talk, but Changeling is one of my special focuses, and I'm like, oh God, let me just talk everything all the time. And I realize I'm also apologizing because I am the one woman on this panel. Hooray!
Nothing to apologize for at all.
But I love y'all. You're wonderful. But for Changeling, I always go back to Judith Herman's Trauma in Recovery, because Changeling is very much trauma, but through a glass darkly. So you have that magical thinking that comes with trauma, but in Changeling, that magical thinking is actually real. So you have the courts for Changeling, which are all different stages of grief. So like spring is denial, summer is anger, autumn is bargaining, winter is sorrow. And you have the kiths and the seemings, all of which have their own tones, which actually serve to make a very individual narrative come together in a cohesive whole. And you can take these little bits of individual narratives and you can weave them together into this tapestry because of these tones, the tones and the atmospheres that the experiences of the shared experience of having these flashbacks all bring together this very personal, but also this very solidarity building horror in a way.
Right, and that's because a lot of the other players are people who have escaped the hedge, who are dealing with this body horror. And the personal horror is also very much when you have a doppelganger take your place, living with your family. Changeling the Lost is a wonderful game to explore those avenues. Wesley or Nick, what are some of the ways that you introduce horror and tone and atmosphere?
All right, for sure. Yeah, so like I was saying before, I don't have as much experience in publishing and producing as much as these great people around me. All of you do excellent work, so I'm honored to be here. But what I like to do in my own games, and especially with like at-home games here, is providing agency for the players to kind of set their own tone for horror. It's their own actions that kind of lead to the horror. Alien RPG really lends to that. A favorite system of mine, Dread, that I got to run last Halloween, is it works really well. There's no rolling of dice. You're playing with a Jenga tower, so you have that instrument of horror sitting right in the middle of the table, and the framework of what's scary or terrifying. I'm just describing the settings and things that could be off for them, but it's their own action, their own decision making that really kind of lend to their own horror, that their own kind of sense of dread and terror of like, am I throwing myself into the lion's den by just like checking out a door or turning on the lights in the kitchen, or am I just being set up by somebody?
Mainly the storyteller.
Mm-hmm.
Mainly the storyteller. Yeah. I like to.
That would never happen. I don't know what you mean.
I like to set up some hints, and sometimes I'm not a big fan of jump scares or anything, but I do like to tease, don't tell with my games, of really using descriptions of shadows. Smell is something I know that Jason does really good on his games that I've seen him storytell, is using a sense of smell to help set a tone. It's one of those things that doesn't get brought up in a lot of games, because sight, sound, especially the music, is one that's always brought up. But sense of smell, I was a chef for a long time, so you can always tell if something's going wrong by a distinct smell in the air.
Your fear levels start to rise as something starts to burn in your own kitchen. That's a really good analogy for setting that kind of tone, whether it's video, audio, just mentioning those things. I like, especially speaking of Jason, when you do LA by Night and you're talking about, oftentimes you'll have the coterie at a club or a bar. You'll always make sure to mention that they're not alone. They're in a room full of people. Mm-hmm. And especially with something like the Masquerade, where you have to watch every move. I think it was almost unintentional, but in LA by Night, you had a scene where Jasper was dancing with the Scourge, Lasam. And even though it wasn't anything that was overtly violent or conflictory, they weren't exactly ready about to throw down, it was still extremely tense, because you're literally dancing with the enemy and anything could go wrong.
It was definitely tense. I don't know if it was, that's what I heard. I don't know if it was, yes, it was definitely tense and dramatic. I don't know if it was horrible, but it certainly fed into the horror of the situation. And for me, when I run tabletop horror games, once everyone has agreed upon the story frame and we understand what our guidelines are and where everybody's limits are, and we agree on what consent rules we're using and how we're going to take care of each other before and after, you can really explore deep, visceral fear. And fear can come from many, many different sources. Fear is the essence of horror. And we're talking about tone and atmosphere here today. So tone and atmosphere, whether it's in horror writing or filmmaking or theater or tabletop role-playing, can be used to produce or encourage that fear. For tone, generally, I find it's not what you say, but how you say it. Any ordinary situation can become fearful with the introduction of the right adjectives or adverbs, the right pitch of voice, or the right implication. One of the things I loved about what Jack said about Changeling is that a lot of the fear, the horror, comes from that fragmentary narrative revealed slowly over time, the piecing together of disparate information, creating a growing picture of terrible revelation. The same is true even for small horror scenes in tabletop RPG. You can use very tiny moments, even in ordinary scenes, to make them more fearful. That, I think, relates to the overall atmosphere of the scene. Atmosphere is part setting, it's part tone, it's look and feel. It's the visual aesthetic, the environment itself. Some locations are inherently more horrifying than others. Generally, though, it's about uncertainty and loss of control, or the potential loss of control. Yeah. So in the scene that you referenced in LA by Night, where Jasper the Nosferatu is out on the dance floor, surrounded by a sea of mortals who could expose them at any second as being creatures of the night, dancing with La Sombra Scourge. The terror, the horror of the situation comes from not knowing what is going to happen. Will one of them throw down? Will one of them attack? Will a mortal discover what they truly are? Will an enemy interrupt? And also, it's such a mundane, ordinary action, dancing in a club. But with the right introduction of a new tone and the potential of the loss of control, and with the truth of the situation obscured, yet to be revealed, suddenly it becomes potentially horrifying.
Absolutely. Yes, Jack.
So another game I think that does this really well is, from both a writing and a jamming perspective, is Bluebeard's Bride.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Really yes. A piece of genius.
Very much. Something that it does is takes away the player's ability to reach for the first thing that a lot of tabletop role players think of in a tense situation, which is violence. And replaces it. You still can do violence, but you can also caress a horror, or you can cry out for help. And every room, especially in the Book of Rooms, which is an amazing source book, is described in terms of touch, in terms of smell, in terms of it's very sensual and very visceral. And all of the writing is focused on the senses, not on how the character's feeling, not on how they should feel, but very much this room smells of rot and dirt, and there's plants that are rustling, even though the air is very still, and it creates this immediate sense of eeriness or unease. So.
Yeah, absolutely, Jax. And a really great thing to do when you're running an RPG is just have a little sticky note with the 5 sentences right there on your storyteller screen or something like that.
Oh, that's cool. I like that.
And just go down the line. It's a good way to set the scene for your players, but also gives you some time to kind of coalesce exactly what's going to be going on in this scene or in this location. I really like doing that.
That's a great piece of advice.
Yeah,
I'm stealing that immediately.
Yeah,
definitely.
I think Chronicles of Darkness had a printout you could use for that, right? It was like scene by scene, and what the focus was, where it was mental, physical, social. I really liked that about Chronicles. Mike, what are some other ways? I know you've been storytelling for a while that you have used to set tone in horror. Especially, we were talking before stream about your Dark Ages game and like how they were wrapped with sunlight around them.
Indeed. Well, that aside, actually, it was funny that we started off talking about Changeling because this whole discussion triggered a memory. The first time I ever ran Vampire the Masquerade, like 15 years ago or something, there was a technique I used to set the atmosphere and set the tone for every single session, which is basically had like a 2-paragraph little narrative that I read every single session. It was the same thing, basically, to set the tone of what was going on in Marseille, France. And that was really great to kind of get everyone on board, get them all united in kind of the story that we're going to tell, and to remind them exactly what this World of Darkness was really about. That was a lot of fun to do, and I've actually never done it again. So I want to try that in the future.
That's a great
thing. Yeah.
I think something to go off of, kind of like what everyone's been saying, but the old phrase I've always known is that whatever the players can think up in their head is always going to be 10 times scarier than what you can show them. And
yes.
Yeah.
They will rush to cover your most egregious lapses in narrative logic with that potential horror of discovery and revelation. I'm very grateful for that, because it means I don't have to work quite so hard all the time.
There's a particular trope called fridge horror, which I think is so great to use. And honestly, it's just essentially what you said, that they'll come to realize something and they'll connect 2 dots that you've never expected. And that slow realization that creeps onto their face and inspires this kind of like feeling of hopelessness, which going back to Changeling the Lost for a second, I think that's one of the best themes that game does, is that you are just in a, excuse my language, shitty situation and getting out of it. And it's really just about making best with the tools you have. And even then, it's never really enough.
Yeah. And especially with going forward from this horrific thing you've just been going through, that uncertainty, I think, can lend a lot of horror to that personal story. Nick, while we've got you, I know that you are very into the visual arts, and you've got things like Lovecraft, where like we're talking about right now, there's a lot of tell, don't show. It's the fear of the visual unknown. How do you use that with your own setting and tone and atmosphere?
Well, it can even be, I think one of the best tips that I've seen, or best like uses I've seen, is showing little parts of the whole. Like, never show the whole. You show, like, take for, to give a few film examples, in Alien, you never really see the alien at all. You always see parts of it, or you see flashes of it, or maybe shadows of it. Or even in another film of It Follows, to kind of quote a more modern horror film, you never see what the true form of the monster is. You just know it's there. And I think in that mind, not being able to comprehend it is much more scarier. It's, humanity doesn't like to not know things. The fear of the unknown is one of our deepest, most primal fears.
It's very true. And I like movies like The Thing, where the monster can take any shape, and some of the shapes that it shows are truly horrific, and the visual aspects of that movie are really well done. But the scariest part is that you could be looking at any face in front of you, and that could be the creature. It can easily take someone over with one exposure of a single cell. So the people that you trust, I love that about Vampire the Masquerade. Sometimes the very players at your table can be ready to put a knife in your back. And there's a lot of games that do that. What are some of the other games you guys can think of that used horror and just the tone and atmosphere in a really good way? I know we've been talking about Cult of the Lost a lot lately. A lot of the World of Darkness games are great for it, but I'd like to hear from you guys.
Red Markets is great.
Tell us about that.
So Red Markets, as described by its designers, is a zombie apocalypse game where the real enemy is capitalism. So the game actually frames everything in terms of capitalist economic terms. So the GM is known as the market. The part of the world that is currently rebuilding from the zombie apocalypse itself is called the recession. The part of the world that's still in chaos and being destroyed and remade is the loss. If you're playing a boom version of Red Markets, you're playing a very high action, high octane version where you're, blowing off zombie heads and taking in big bounties and whatnot. And if you're playing a bust version, you're playing something where you have to count all of your material and you have to make sure that you have everything you need to survive a trek across the loss. And it's very much this game that sets this very rigid capitalist economic horror while still having a zombie plague that is referred to as black juice by a lot of people, because under an electron microscope, it's just black goo. It doesn't have any microorganelles or amoebas or cells or anything. It's just black. And so you have that fear of the unknown, you have that fear of what the hell's going on, but you also have this very rigid, hierarchical, almost, really fascist government in the US that's defining everything in terms of loss and supply and demand, because that's sometimes what you have to do to survive in that setting.
Right.
And it's very cool that it has this very cold assessment of everything that's going on in its game.
I want to check that out. That sounds terrific.
Yeah, it sounds like the very world and how that's set up is just meant to just put pressure on the player, which is very interesting.
Let me show you my copy, because it's very cool. This is my copy of Red Markets.
Ooh, I love the cover.
Oh, wow.
Isn't that beautiful?
Yeah.
And economic horror.
Yeah. No, this is an amazing game, and I've strongly recommend
That would
y'all
never happen
check
either.
it out.
This is too far-fetched.
But I strongly recommend you all check it out because it is written by some friends of mine and it's excellent. It won an Indie Groundbreaker award. It's very, very good.
Well, I can't wait to check it out and run it sometime. I mean, just showing up to economics class sometimes is an hour enough for me.
Oh, I get that.
Well, sure, horror is a filter. There are many tabletop RPGs that are specifically horror games, but you can bring horror into any tabletop RPG. I run Dungeons and Dragons very much the way I run LA by Night. So my Curse of Strahd game is quite horrifying and scary. And I think you can choose to set horror as a filter, or perhaps a modulating lever on any experience, from Kids on Bikes to Tales of the Loop, from Dungeons and Dragons to Warhammer, whatever story engine that you enjoy. If you want to tell a horror story, you can flip that switch, and tone and atmosphere will probably be the tools you use to do that. Mike is about to. Mike wishes to contribute.
Quite famously, Adam Sink over at Phonemill RPG ran a game called Ponies of Sin,
Yes.
which was a crossover between Hellraiser and My Little
I
Pony.
wondered if this was going to come up.
I am so excited about this now. This is the first I've heard of it.
Go on.
Go on, yeah. No
Stop.
teases like
What
that.
is
Yeah.
your mind out?
I don't know much about it.
on the story.
Hellraiser and My Little Pony. I mean, what can go wrong? Cenobites rolling in as ponies, pins everywhere. It's great.
I think there's actually a game happening this weekend that one of our community members is running, and it's Call of Cthulhu, but with Pokemon.
Yeah, Pokethulu.
I love that.
Oh man, I would pay to be in that game.
Pocket
Wow.
abominations.
That has the potential to be the scariest thing that happens this weekend, and that's saying something.
And there's a
Wow.
pandemic around, yeah.
Incredible. Outbreak Undead, another favorite. Wow.
Can I admit a shameful secret about tone?
Sure.
So, like I said, I've been writing for Chronicles of Darkness and Cult Divinity Lost and a couple of other horror games for a couple years now. Do you guys want to know what game book actually taught me the importance of tone in horror?
Absolutely.
Heroes of Horror for D&D 3.5.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
It's not, if you look at it as a D&D book on its own merits, it's not a very good book.
No.
I'll admit that. It doesn't play into the core gameplay loop of D&D, and it's very much sort of in its own little universe. But it is, if you are looking at it as a textbook for writing tone, it is a great 101 textbook. It is a phenomenal 101 textbook because I came to gaming through D&D at 6 years old. Most of my experience with gaming was D&D. I had no idea how to run horror, and I was very interested in doing that. And this book breaks it down into, like, here are some themes that cause horror to happen, like loss and betrayal and, pressure of time and all this other stuff. And I'm like, what? You can do that? And yeah, it's a great text. Like, reading it now, I'm like, oh, it says that in order to horrify your players, you should have a large stain of blood on the floor. And I'm like, that's not horrifying. But it also has things like, well, your character goes upstairs and they open a door into a room full of jack-o'-lanterns that are set with human eyes and teeth. And I'm like, that's actually pretty creepy.
Yeah.
I like that. So aside from being on the content creation or narrative side of things, what are some personal experiences you've each had at the gaming table as players, no matter what game it was, that you can think on that kind of either really impacted you or inspired you to go forward and also take that genre of horror and bring it to the masses?
A friend of mine ran a game using the Savage World system, which balance-wise is not very balanced at all. But it's a very excellent entry point into tabletop, especially if you've only ever heard of Dungeons and Dragons and you want to expand more. But it was a very Silent Hill influenced kind of game. He had a whole map of a town laid out. It was all named after different horror writers and everything, much like Silent Hill. And we all played normal people. That was the guidelines that he made when creating a character. He's like, you're playing normal people. I played a writer, showed my hand that I'm very into Stephen King, and most of his characters are authors. But like that was a sense of powerlessness. That when I went into a situation, it's like, oh, I can't just grab a sword and a shield and deal with this like convenience store clerk that won't stop smiling. It's very creepy. Yeah. It's like you're just going into a convenience store and the guy's smiling. It's like I have to think a little bit more like how a person in that situation would think. And so it was very on my feet and tense the whole way around. And it was like a very like just the description of a bag of chips in a flickering light was like enough to like set me over.
That's really cool.
That's awesome. Who's next?
Yeah, when I talk about and think about horror gaming, it's pretty interesting. I don't know about like visceral horror and the like, but a lot of social issues, especially when I was like a teenager, I actually explored a lot through role-playing games, especially Vampire, Shadowrun, the like. So it's interesting to kind of use the lens of horror as like kind of a personal journey in a lot of ways to really just discuss things that are wrong with the world and just see how I've changed a lot over time associated with that.
That's a good point. It reminds me a little bit of Tales from the Loop about how you can't die per se, but your character becomes broken, and you're either scared or you're confused. One of the things I really like about it is you have kind of like a touchstone in Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition. You have someone that's like your anchor, your rock, whether it's a parent or the kind janitor at school that just stops and listens to the concerns of the kids. And as a player, and when you don't always have to role-play vulnerability or openness, especially in life. Sometimes you can be very guarded. And to play a game like that gets you into a safe role-playing environment where you can interactively, in a narrative sense, rely on somebody else and go to this character as a method of healing your player character. I think that's very fascinating. It's that even just being in that situation of how many of us can be very closed off or not sharing as much about ourselves, even just sharing your player character's emotions, what they're going through, can be very intimidating and can be.
Oh, sure. That's sort of that sort of intimacy can contribute to a horror narrative by all means. Players who have characters that are typically closed off or secretive or scared of showing their vulnerabilities. When they reach those moments, choosing to trust, right, that can be very terrifying and very scary. And again, it goes right back to the atmosphere of the unknown, the obscure, the hidden. You don't know what the consequences of that choice will be. And that's where the fear and the horror happens. I think for me, the catalytic event was a Call of Cthulhu game when I was, a long time ago when I was in junior high, in which the game master, she set an incredible atmosphere for us just through well-chosen words and the pitch of her voice. And we ended up being scared out of our wits by a standoff confrontation with a house cat. She took the completely mundane and ordinary and made it terrifying for us.
That's my favorite kind of tone in horror, I think, is taking something that is very, very ordinary and looking at it and suddenly it's just this monstrous, horrific thing.
Ari Aster does a really good job with that with his films.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Oh, man.
Like, it's like just the whole atmosphere as a whole. It's like that building is just off kilter a little bit. And I'm like, okay, yeah, I'm freaked out.
Yeah, why is it even built that way?
It's one of the most effective uses of atmosphere in horror is the slow realization that the world is not what you thought it was. I think to go back to Jax's original thoughts where we started, Changing the Lost does an excellent job of narrating the creeping dread or the creeping truth that what you thought was true isn't really true.
Yep.
That's super scary. I mean, we're all living it right now, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Time is a fractal spiral, and nothing is real.
I think something that can also be mentioned is the uncanniness or the fear of the uncanniness, and kind of like what we've been talking about, the idea of like something just not being right, and talking about Ari Aster and Midsummer, his most recent film, where he terrifies you in broad daylight, and he does that with just this like sinking sense of uncanniness. To go to my own personal story, the DM that started me off with D&D and actually exposed me to Heroes of Horror, which I thought was really kind of a cool coincidence that you brought that up, Jax. The idea of that he after the campaign was done, I talked to him. I was like, well, where did you get the idea to run this horror game, or what was your like guiding principle going forth? And he told me, I have my personal principle is called When the Silence Breaks, where before every every bit of horrifying detail, before every horrifying break that you find in the game, there's always just this moment of silence where the player basically is faced with what they think they fear the most, or their own introspection. And when that silence breaks, that sudden rapture entry into that horror. And I think that's even used in jump scares. I mean, before every jump scare now we see these days, there's silence, that uncanny safety that we feel.
I love that. That's great.
Yeah. Yeah.
As of recently, I did a Call of Cthulhu game, my first Call of Cthulhu game I've run, and it was at PAX East, and I was a little intimidated because there was some players who've been playing Call of Cthulhu for a long time. So here I am, a new storyteller, playing or doing this narrative to people who are very used to the game, and I wasn't sure how that was going to go. But I did something I haven't done in a role-playing game before, where someone walked into a situation. It was very strange. They were trying to talk to an older woman and get some clues about what was going on later down the line. One of them walked into a kitchen to make someone who was in distress a sandwich. Uh-oh. And as they walked in, there was a man with a dirty face, like a cultist, clearly holding a knife, just standing there, staring at the person. And they backed out, and they're like, okay, we need to leave. And like they took the other player there with them, walked outside, and it went on from there, and the story progressed. And after the game, I was like, what did you find to be some of your highlights? He's like, the guy in the kitchen. He didn't chase us. He didn't do anything. He was just there holding a knife. And the fact that I don't know why, or why he didn't chase me, that's the weirdest thing of the whole thing. That freaked me out, man. And I was like, it's interesting when you see something scary and you expect something to happen and it doesn't. How that can sometimes be horrific on its own. And I just found that out by experimentation. I thought that was really interesting.
I know.
Oh, go ahead, please.
I know that Ian is interviewing the writers of the Magnus Archives later this weekend.
Oh, fantastic. Very cool.
They're amazing. And something that I think they do really well is, again, that sort of uncanniness. Mm-hmm. That's sort of not something happening where you don't expect it, or something is very wrong with something that is already creepy. Like, one of their first episodes is about a coffin that is chained shut. And it's just a coffin. And, I mean, later on you find out it's very important. But in that episode, it doesn't do anything except when it rains. And then it starts singing. But this coffin that is chained shut just sings when it rains.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that was one of the moments where I'm like, I have to binge this podcast, because that gave me physical chills.
And when the mundane acts in an unexpected way, it generates a lot of fear. It can also generate dreadful curiosity too, which is pretty awesome.
Yes.
I think it's their first episode.
Like, I don't want to look away, but
Yeah.
I think it's their first episode, but the anglerfish.
Yep, episode 1.
mm, yeah.
Do you got a light? Like,
It's a cigarette. Yeah.
Just playing on a loop.
Mm-hmm. Do you got a light?
Creepy. I couldn't think of what to do in a particular horror game once, and I decided to throw in a very ordinary situation and turn it weird, and just to see where the story would go. The character was sitting outside a tavern. I think maybe he was feeding his horse. I don't recall. Fantasy role-playing game, and 2 crows flew down and landed next to him. And they looked at him, and then the one crow looked at the other crow and said, "Should we do it now?" And the other crow says, "No, now we have to wait. It's not time yet." But I didn't know what would happen at that point in the story. The story went into a completely unexpected and very fearful direction from there. In the player's mind, this was it. This was the terrible inciting incident that would define their career forever in that character. And so moments of complete ordinariness that take a hard left turn into the unexpected can be very, very effective ways to generate horror, I think. Sometimes they're about tone, sometimes they're about atmosphere, sometimes they're about both. And sometimes it's just a couple of talking birds.
I love the V5 storyteller screen comes with the Storyteller's Toolkit book, and there's a list of like 100 omens that you can literally roll a die and pick from. And that kind of reminds me of that. Just strange things that are part of the setting that can happen that make players question, is this part of the narrative? Is this something that's supposed to be a clue, or is this just here to really freak me out? I love that.
There's such a good chart. I use that in other games other than V5. Like, I just have it off to the side. One of my favorites is like you see like a heart on like a deck of cards, but then you also see a heart on the back of somebody's jacket. You see it in the window, like those
a white
like
rabbit in Matrix.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You just see it in everywhere. Like it's so full of like great omens like that.
We had a good question from the chat, Puppy Lover. How do you handle mixing romance and horror with proper entwined tone without ruining the atmosphere of one with the
Excellent
other?
question.
Jacqueline looks like she is on fire now.
Hi, hello. Wow, this question was like made for me. That's very exciting.
It's like almost like you were targeted.
I know, right?
Coincidence?
But yeah, no. It's actually easier than you think, because one of the common links between horror and romance is tension.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can play that same note of tension, does this person want to kill me or kiss me? Does this person really have my best interests at heart? You can create a very effective romantic horror. And like I mentioned Bluebeard's Bride earlier. Bluebeard's Bride can go incredibly romantic, especially if you decide that your husband is just a victim of all of these ghosts in the house, or that you want to become very attached to one of the servants. Someone else in the chat says, and vulnerability. And yes, vulnerability is huge in both romance and horror, and having your character just constantly being in this spot of being on guard, but also not wanting to be on guard, wanting to see what's beyond the guard, is so good. And there's so much space for story in that fertile liminal ground of, if I push a little farther, if I ask the right questions, what will happen?
It's
For
really
both
important.
of them.
Yeah, could say it better myself.
One thing from my perspective, when I don't know, it's just the way I storytell. It's a lot of levity and brevity, and I find that somehow we always end up laughing and just having a good time. And I put a lot of humor into my games, even when it's not intentional. And when you have that roller coaster of emotions, where at 1 minute you're laughing and you're joking about something, and the next minute there's something creepy or horrific, I think that is a really good way to also make the horror spike, like what Jacqueline was just saying. when you have the vulnerability and the feelings of romantic or just flirtatious or any kind of those different emotions, mixing them with horror, whether it's personal, interpersonal, the atmosphere, the music. Those can take horror and just put it higher and higher on a pedestal. I know we got to wrap soon, but what else? Does anyone have anything else to say about that?
Yeah, definitely. Kind of speaking about like comedy and that sort of thing, there's a really interesting kind of like pacing to take a look at through an anime, which is called Neon Genesis Evangelion. Pretty famous one. That one, it starts off like every episode.
Sounds obscure, Mike.
Every episode, there's always like kind of goofy anime stuff, a lot of laughing, some comedy, but slowly as you go through, the tension builds.
Oh, yeah.
Those kind of touchstones of humor are less and less frequent. And then there's one point where something terrible happens. And then for the whole rest of the show, there is no comedy. Everything's serious. Everything's just pure tension. So it's interesting to kind of balance those like points of light and those kinds of like moments to the overall dread that you're kind of building through this game in your RPG, and kind of picking that point at which you're like, all right, I'm ready. We're towards the climax, towards the finale, and this is where it's just going to go all dark from here.
I think,
Absolutely.
Sure, I think comedy can definitely complement horror, and a horrific atmosphere can either be lightened temporarily by humor, or I think humor can throw the horror into sharp relief. Horror comedy is a subgenre of film. I think about things like I, Zombie, or Shaun of the Dead, Cabin in the Woods. These have grim humor, dark humor. They're definitely funny moments, but that just serves to heighten the truly terrible, horrific feelings that the stories generate.
I think one thing to know, the last thing I'll say, just in the fact that I think all horror ties to things that you notice as a child or even as a baby. I know Jason was talking about that dreadful curiosity. And I think that it can even tie back to when you were a kid and watching something that you knew was terrifying, and you would watch it through the intersections of your eyes because you don't want to see it, but you also do. And I think even tying that back to the whole romance and horror, isn't that like one of the biggest kind of lures? Like you want that romance, but it's like, how much are you willing to get hurt? How much danger are you willing to put yourself through? And it's that risk reward.
Sacrifice.
Very much.
What about you, Wes?
Let's see. Everything's all been pushed forward and said really well. Let's see. I don't know. I agree with the points of humor and everything. Everyday life. Dan Simmons does a lot of that with like his tension building in his novels. That's probably my primary focus, unlike a lot of things horror related, is and it's said before, is the mundane being made horrified. Jeff Vandermeer does it well with his novels.
I love Annihilation.
Annihilation, yeah. Just the description of a flower, but it's off color, or it has a different petal design. A lighthouse in the distance that there doesn't seem to be a door or anything. Junji Ito right behind me with Uzumaki behind here does an excellent job of setting things. There's the mosquito story within that novel where you spend the whole time in the hospital and there's women that are getting ready to give birth. It's things like that just really ramp it up, and things that I like to put into my own work as well. Something as simple as going grocery shopping, like The Mist.
Lately, that is pretty horrific.
Yes, yeah, very on topic.
Well,
I'm actually going to be running a game on my Discord server on Easter where you're all playing changelings who can't see each other because of social distancing.
Ooh, that's fun.
So everybody's gonna take clarity hits and
All right.
deal with that.
Oh,
So,
that's going to be thrilling. I look forward to your afternoons.
Well, we have to wrap. I really appreciate all of you talking about tone and horror and your experiences, and I know that I've learned quite a bit. I had a great time. Thank you for joining us at Virtual Horror Con, everybody.
Thank you guys so much.
Thanks very much for having us. This was such a great idea. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank
been
you.
an absolute pleasure.
This is phenomenal. And your audience is wonderful too.
Yes.
Thank you for watching and tuning in.
Yeah, we'll do this again sometime. Have a great day.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.